The title kind of spoils some of the intrigue of this story, but aren't you curious how something so peculiar could happen? How an old halfling, full of as much love as a grandmother, managed to do what so many self-absorbed wizards study for decades just to fail at. This is the story of a character I lovingly called Nelda, meaning of the Elder Tree, and the tragic end to her long, long life. How a sweet old lady became a Druidic Lich by accident. Nelda Prime, or the first, original Nelda, I played as a pretty normal character all things considered, at least by my standards of normal character. She was a halfling spore druid who interestingly enough despised in death. I got to homebrew with my DM at the time some alternate spells for my subclass list that I could use instead of the very necromancy-based usual ones, and since the point of the campaign was to fight against a growing undead threat, Nelda had a built-in reason to care about the campaign and I could have some fun with an interesting subclass. Nelda herself was an old halfling. In equivalent human years she was around 65 to 70-ish. So, considering halflings live for 200 years give or take a few, she was somewhere in the 140 to 180 range. You'd think with all that time she'd be a higher level character, but in all her years of living she had found her meager, LV3, abilities enough. She helped those who needed tending, she raised those who were not cared for, she even had a single biological child of her own that I wrote a little something for, and I'll share if this gets some interest. But she was content. She moved from forest to forest, township to township, never settling down very long but bringing much needed relief to more often than not struggling peoples. Her origin doesn't really matter and is quite plain and boring, as is most often the case, but to the people she helped she was uniquely marvelous. That campaign never finished due to scheduling issues and the couple that were dating breaking up, so I never got to see Nelda's story to completion. A couple of years later I moved to a bigger city for university and get invited to a Curse of Strahd campaign, and my new DM is ecstatic that the new player actually gives a darn about roleplay. All his other players are new and didn't have a clue what to do. Hence their backstories are quite plain, so he gives me a bunch of leeways to do whatever the heck I want thematically as long as it doesn't impact the mechanics too much. Now after playing Nelda I had kind of become obsessed with spore druids. They are incredibly fun to play with thematically, and they basically let me be a martial player while still having the utility to be an all-rounder for the rest of the party. As such I jump at any chance to play them again. Curse of Strahd seemed like the perfect setting for it, so I pitch an idea, a Druidic Lich, keeping itself eternal and alive through a mycelial network growing in the very land itself. My phylactery is the land itself, new bodies stored in mushroom pods underground after the host dies, reused as the replacement body of this Lich each time they need one, and so Morel Portobello was born, having no real concept of gender as they change bodies and species so often they are they through and don't particularly care for either option, frankly speaking. But they were here long before Barovia became a demi-plane of dread, long before Barovia was even Barovia, and so Strahd cursing this place, my place to this eternal damnation is not okay, and they have been trying to usurp Strahd with different adventuring parties since Barovia's conception. Never quite doing enough to kill him, being killed, then resetting to the last memory save a new body. The network only remembers what has been saved into it if the time has been spent to do as much. Think like a computer system. There are access nodes all throughout Barovia, but unless I managed to crawl half dead to one of these nodes, the actual death and lead up to it could never be remembered in the new body. Now you may be wondering, as is your right, what on earth Morel has to do with Nelda, and let me tell you, this is where it gets absolutely heartbreaking. Nelda, in her final decades, when she couldn't travel around quite as much as she used to, set herself up just outside the little township that she had raised her son and many other little boys and girls in, and she helped raise many more until her body started to fail her, and as age often does, started to take more of her agency. Soon those sons and daughters, who she had cared for so carefully and lovingly, returned her kindness tenfold. They took turns feeding her, taking care of her, going out and trying to find different medicines to keep her alive just that little bit longer. But Nelda was old, and this was her time. No one can reject the call of death forever, not even the undead, and this was her time. She slowly sent away everyone, with her best wishes, thanking them for their time and care, but to not waste their limited years on a frail old halfling who has had far too many of them. All but one left, their final condition. This one daughter would stay until Nelda's final moments, bury her under the roots of an elder tree, and travel to all of Nelda's sons and daughters and tell them the news. They did not want her dying alone, and so Nelda accepted. To their word, none of the other sons and daughters ever lingered long. Some would come to visit, especially those who lived in the nearby village, but never for long, and always leaving. Finally, maybe a year, maybe a decade later, Nelda lay in her bed, her lovely daughter, a beautiful young wood elf, with auburn hair and deep brown eyes, by her side, as Nelda took her final breaths and closed her eyes for the last time. Except she didn't. She awoke sometime later, sitting in the seat her daughter had been in, resting her head on the bedding with her hand holding some sort of mushroom tendril connected to a much larger mass growing at the headboard of the bed. It's quite startling to wake up again after you think you've died, and at first, she's incredibly cross. Her sons and daughters must have fed her some new sort of fan-dangled concoction to keep her alive for longer, but as she goes to stand up she hits her head on the ceiling of what used to be the perfect height for a halfling's house. Nelda pauses a moment, then looks down at her hands again. Long, thin, delicate fingers, with an olive tone, greet her gaze, nothing like her usual short and calloused hands that she'd worked hard to get so useful. There's a pond out the front they use to keep fish fresh in, and she rushes to it, dreading the worst but hoping beyond hope she's not right. She gets to the water's edge, looks down at what should be a very elderly halfling woman, and sees a panicked young wood elf with auburn hair and deep brown eyes. No, but that can't be right, she must be seeing things. There was a hand mirror stored away under the bed, and so Nelda rushes back inside and looks back to the bed. She takes a moment and stares at the mushroom mass a little closer. Just visible, the tip of a finger resting on top of the covers, the edge of a cheekbone a little higher on the headboard, some old gray hair down the left falling over a purple mushroom cap. Her children hadn't done this. She had, in all her years she had never believed her mentors, never believed her colony was sentient or had wants and machinations of its own, had convinced herself that as long as she had come to terms with the fact she would die, her colony would surely accept her passing and move on to a new host. Her daughter was even prepared for it. But the colony hadn't just moved, it had brought her with it, and the colony would not let her go so easily. Despite all her best efforts, Nelda had become that which she detested the most, a being of death, a mockery of nature itself, and doing so had killed her daughter. Nelda could not bring herself to harm her daughter's flesh, but neither could she stay. Her life, her and death was a burden she need carry alone, and so she leaves, doesn't even close the door on her way out, eventually settling in what will be Barovia, but it's still many centuries until then. Slowly, oh so slowly, through many different lifetimes and many different bodies, her memory starts to fail. Just little things at first, like the name of the town she grew up in, and the face her father used to make when she would bring home different bits of sticks and mud, then bigger things like why they were out here in the first place. Oh, but that didn't matter too much. Their land needed someone to care for it, and it was no trouble really. By the start of the second campaign, only 3 core fundamentals of whom morale remains. 1. My name was Nelda, but I do not deserve it any longer. It hurts to hear people say it, but I don't remember why. 2. Family and kin are everything. But there are none left anymore. 3. I need to stay alive so that I can fix the problem. What's the problem? There are many more stories I could tell from the campaigns themselves. They were just as tragic and heart-wrenching, with some silly fun bits thrown in. But this was and is the story of my character in this mess, and how a little old lady became a Druidic Lich. If you enjoyed today's tale of Nelda, then why not stick around and enjoy another tale on screen now?